Hello friends, so today's video is going to be a list of the books that I found to be the most surprising that I picked up in 2022. This is surprising in both a good way and a bad way. So I'm just going to jump right into it. I'm going to start maybe a little bit on the negative side. Just because it didn't work for me though, of course, doesn't mean that it won't work for you. But the first one I'm going to mention would be Fevered Star. This is the sequel to Black Sun. I really enjoyed Black Sun. It was, I think, one of my favorite books that I read the year that I read it, which I think was 2021. And I was really excited for the sequel, especially given how things leave off in the first book. And I actually liked the way in which the second book starts, because so much happens at the very end and it's such a roller coaster and everything moves so quickly in Black Sun that I was kind of happy to see how the dust had settled. But then once the dust settled, I didn't really like where everything went after that. And it's to a point now where I probably will keep going with the trilogy, but I just don't know. I really didn't care for that second book, and it has kind of sadly dampened my enthusiasm for this series. The next two books were surprising in good ways. One of them would be Monsters, We Defy, and the other would be the Book of Gothel. So the thing that was surprising about both of these, the reason I'm grouping these together, would be how much I enjoyed them based off of their setting. So with Monsters, We Defy, it is taking place in America, and it is essentially historical fiction, but there is magic. Magic is not necessarily known to everyone, but our main character has magic, and the magic kind of has to do with having a curse, but then also a boon. And your boon and your curse are very related to one another, and usually you ask for the boon or you accept the boon because you don't think that the curse is going to be that big of a deal, and it ends up playing a huge impact on your life. It essentially ruins your life. So it's kind of like if X-Men had cons to their powers that were directly related to the pros of their powers. And obviously, sorry, this is... I'm going off on a side tangent. I was just going to say, some of the X-Men already have cons associated with their powers. But I mean like a very specific, okay, you have this power, but also this will happen. So there's a really sad amount of circumstances when you find out about the characters. And I was surprised how quickly the author was able to make me care about the characters, because this is essentially a heist story. And so each new character you're introduced to, you get kind of a mini backstory to. And there's one in particular especially that I was like, this guy better get a happy life at the end of this because he deserves it. Anyway, I was really surprised at how much I cared so quickly, but then on top of that, I usually like settings that are a little bit older, or I like settings that feel like sci fantasy, where it is fantasy, but it's not necessarily medieval feeling. It feels like it's progressed and that it is embracing technology, those kinds of things, but it is very much a fantasy setting. And so this one, it wasn't, and it takes place in a time period that usually doesn't interest me as much when it comes to fantasy, but I really liked this story. I wouldn't say it was one of my top 5 of the year necessarily, but it was one of my favorites overall of the year. I really enjoyed it, and I was surprised given how many things that aren't necessarily my bookish buzzwords. And then with the Book of Gothel, this is one where I think a lot of people had the opposite reaction. They were surprised that it turned out to be a negative for them, but for me, it actually worked. So the Book of Gothel is a villain origin story, essentially, for Gothel, the villain in the Rapunzel story. But when you think villain origin story, especially for a fairy tale, I think that evokes a different idea than what this book actually delivered. This book was just basically medieval fantasy. It very much feels like we're looking at medieval Germany, and this one individual, this one woman, how she was mistreated as a result of not really fitting into what society thought a woman should fit into. And she desperately wants a family someday. She desperately wants her own family to be a unit, and she doesn't have that. And the way that her day-to-day life was shown, the way that the things that motivate her, the things that she wants for herself but she can't have, all of those things that we see in the story, I thought were really well done. I really liked it. I liked how it felt like the author had done so much research, and it felt like she was transporting me to that time. So I had a lot of care for this this character. I really liked it. I completely understand that a lot of people went into it wanting it to be more fantasy leaning, and there is some magic, but it doesn't really feel, it feels almost like folklore magic. So it's maybe not the wicked type of villain origin story I think other people would have wanted, but I was surprised in a pleasant way with it. Next up, we have Kingdom of the Wicked. I was continuously surprised by this one, not necessarily, sometimes in good ways and then other times in not as good of ways. So when I first picked it up, my impression was going to be that this was going to be a very angsty, dramatic, romance, tension-filled type of fantasy story. And upon first starting it, it seemed like it was a historical fiction murder mystery. And I was like, not what I was expecting, but I actually really like this. I'm kind of excited to see where this goes. And I thought that the way that the author set up the stakes and this feeling of, because the family they're witches, and it's in a time where people were very concerned about witches because it does take place in our own world, you're scared for the character and her family. And then when somebody she cares about is found dead, there is this question of, is it because we're witches? Did somebody figure out? And so I liked the setting and I liked the stakes. And then we started to get more into the fantasy elements, which is usually a plus for me. And this time around, I kind of wanted it to just go back to being a historical fiction murder mystery. And then I was like, okay, so we're getting the fantasy elements. I'm not completely against this. This is fine. But then it was not... Okay, so I have tried to explain why it was so jarring, but it felt somewhat juvenile in the romance, I guess, if you can even call it that. I've heard that the other books in the series get much more romance-driven, but I was fine with, okay, there's going to be tension and it's going to feel very dramatic because this character, even though she's a witch, she also is a very pure-hearted individual, and then she's speaking to the physical embodiments of the 7 deadly sins in an attempt to figure out what happened to this person who she cared about who died. So she's kind of making deals with evil individuals. And so I was like, okay, I get there being this like dramatic romance, but then the love interest, it just felt kind of cheesy, and like I was watching in middle schoolers, when you go somewhere and clearly the middle schoolers are dating. Well, I shouldn't do that. They can date. But I just mean, when you watch them as adults and you're just like, oh, you feel like, I guess it brings me back to when I was a teenager, and I don't know, I feel like flirting was weird and dating was weird. And so that's how it felt with the characters, where I was just kind of uncomfortable. And then I was surprised, like, why does everybody talk about this like it's, oh my gosh, wrath is just, and they're fanning themselves essentially in their captions about wrath, and I'm just like, where? I don't understand. So I think I was just confused, and I kept continuously being surprised at what this book was and then what it was not, and by the end I was like, I kind of just missed it being what it was at the beginning, just being this historical fiction murder mystery. I thought it was actually really interesting at that point. So I guess I was surprised several times when it came to this book, and ultimately I didn't love it. Some fantasy romance that did work for me. We have The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches and Half a Soul. These are 2 books that I feel like everybody's probably really tired of me being like, oh my gosh, they're so cute. But they were really, really sweet, very precious. And I so often don't read fantasy romance. I've been trying to branch out, and I've been trying to read, I feel like the other ones I mentioned for having kind of different settings, that's an example, like Monsters We Defy. That's a book that maybe a few years ago I'd be like, where are the swords and the dragons, where I'd want it to be a specific kind of fantasy, and I'm trying to open up and read more subgenres of fantasy, read fantasy that has unconventional settings. So I have found a lot of books that I have greatly, greatly enjoyed as a result of doing that. And I definitely think Irregular Witches and Half a Soul are an example. There have been a lot of misses for fantasy romance for me, but those 2 have been not just hits, but I truly did love them. I thought they were so sweet, and they just made me so, so happy. So I was very surprised by both of those. Next up is probably the one that maybe surprised wouldn't be the best way to put it, but just sad. Sad that I didn't love it. And that would be Ship of Destiny by Robin Hobb. While I definitely respected so much of what I felt the intentions were behind a lot of what Robin Hobb was doing, while I really respected that she was showing the effects of trauma, the way in which she went about it was really not to my liking. And I can only say, so many times that it's going to be different from person to person. And that's just, here's how I think the best way to summarize it. I will always respect that an author is attempting to have those very serious conversations, that they're attempting to show the effects of the things that Robin Hobb shows in that trilogy. But the risk is that with something so heavy, with so many of these things that are incredibly dark, that when they attempt, for some people, it's not an attempt, it's a success and it works really well. And for others, it's just going to kind of grate. It's not going to work I fell into that latter camp. It didn't work for me. And it was a big bummer, to put it unsophisticatedly. I've talked about this a number of times at this point, so we can go ahead and move on. I'm looking at my list. Art of Prophecy. So Art of Prophecy was so much fun. Almost too much. It was almost a little too cheesy for me. I've talked about this before. But it was delightful. It was a really good time. I think the reason that I would categorize it as surprising is because it's not exactly my brand of humor, but I still really, really enjoyed it. I thought the action scenes were phenomenal. I think that the world itself is incredible and really captivating and really vivid. And I think the descriptions, not only were the descriptions well done in both of the categories I just mentioned of action and the world building, but I also felt that the imagination, the way that the author thought of these settings and then described them, I thought he succeeded very well in both of those camps. And then I also just liked the subversion of some common tropes that we get. So I was very surprised by a lot of what happened in that book. I'm really excited for when we eventually get the sequel. Oh my gosh, the next one. I mean, everybody feels this way. This is nothing. Book of Night. So, I think the problem was I thought that it was such a cool concept. I'm crossing off stuff. I thought it was such a cool concept. I really liked the idea of this magic that is tied to our shadows. It's kind of urban fantasy, and it is discovered that there is this magic associated with shadows, but because it's been kept a secret for so many years, it is difficult to know essentially the rules and limitations of the magic. So you as the reader don't really know the rules and limitations of the magic, but there are a lot of people that are trying to discover that. And there's also the potential to live on forever through your shadow. There's a sense of giving almost sentience to your shadow. And I also thought that the world building details of being able to look at how would celebrities treat being able to alter their shadows and things like that, I thought were really interesting, and I liked all those aspects. But I guess I'm surprised because it was just okay for me, and it was, I think, just okay for a lot of people. It could have been really good, but it almost seemed like it was too short. Like we needed a little bit more time to get to know the characters. We needed a little bit more time to understand why they are the way they are, because there was a lot there. There was so much, and it just didn't quite get expanded on the way that I was hoping. But a book that was really short and was greatly surprising to me was Nettle and Bone. This is another one we've heard about plenty from me this year. I loved this. I picked this up on a whim because one of you recommended T. Kingfisher, and then I've fallen in love with her works ever since. And there's been no looking back. I'm willing to try basically whatever T. Kingfisher has out. Nettle and Bone was not only surprising because I picked it up on a whim and it was great, but because it's so short and it was so great, and because it has a lot of the kind of humor I like, where it's a little morbid and a little dark, but also kind of cheeky and a little cynical, and I just had so much fun with it. Next up, we have Belladonna. This was one that I just wasn't expecting to like as much as I did. It is very moody. It is very atmospheric. It's kind of a blend of being a whodunit and gothic and fantasy. and I really liked the blend. It just worked. I really like the way that this author writes and describes things. On top of that, there's kind of horror elements sprinkled in, and I'm not usually the biggest horror fan, but the little bits of it that we got, I really liked those. It was like seasoning, essentially, just a little bit here and there to bring everything else out. So I really liked those components, and I was surprised that I liked those components so much. It's also kind of an angsty story, and angsty stories aren't always for me, but I did like the angst in this one. It is kind of weird. I completely understand if some people are like, it's a little too weird for me. I get it. I think I'm also partial and a little biased because there is some commentary on grief, and a couple of the quotes I just really resonated with and really, really liked. I wasn't expecting to find that in this gothic horror fantasy story, so I just found that it was such a combination of things that I didn't expect to really love any one of those things, but somehow the way that it all came together really surprised me. Last, we have If You Could See the Sun. This is barely fantasy. It was surprising to me because it was such a end of the year. I'm basically done with my intense reading for the year. I'm kind of taking it slow. Let me pick up this one. This one sounded fun. And I just was so pleasantly surprised by how much I liked it. It is basically contemporary. It's not really fantasy. We follow this girl who randomly one day turns invisible, and then she learns to kind of track the patterns of when she's likely going to turn invisible, and then she uses this random ability to spy on people and essentially become like a private investigator and make money from the opportunities that are granted to her and the access she has when she can be invisible and go anywhere and eavesdrop on anyone. So she's very young. She's a teenager, and she goes to this very elite school. She is essentially the smartest person at the school, but her family financially can no longer afford the tuition for this school, and so our main character only has a short amount of time left before she needs to move and go elsewhere. And despite the fact that she is so brilliant, despite the fact that she is basically the best and brightest there, it doesn't matter because money often is what opens doors, not merit. And so that is what leads her to start doing these somewhat morally questionable things so that she can make money in hopes that she can afford the tuition. And you just have to accept that she turns invisible randomly, and you have to accept that the couple people that she tells, they don't respond in realistic ways, but you're like, it's not the point of the book. The point of the book is commentary on status and class and there's a number of other things that go into it. And it is young adult, so it doesn't maybe get quite as heavy or dark as an adult fantasy with maybe these same themes would, or an adult contemporary book with these same themes would. But I think YA was the place. It just felt really fun at the same time. There's this sense of silliness to it. The main character, she is a teenage girl, and so how she processes things sometimes is very silly. And sometimes she, as smart as she is, can be a little clueless about certain things. So I just found her really endearing. I really liked the book. It's one that I think when I initially talked about it, I even said, I don't know how many of you would like it, but maybe you'll be like me. Maybe you'll pick it up and you'll be surprised by how much you like it. That's it for some of the most surprising reads from 2022. I would love to know what some of the most surprising books were for you. It doesn't have to just be fantasy. And then I would love to know if any of the books on this list also were surprising for you. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you all later. Bye.